Collaboration is a great thing until it's not. Today we're going to talk about dealing with collaboration overload right here on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by 13 Days to Remarkable Leadership, a free leadership video series based on Kevin's book, Remarkable Leadership. Sign up by going to remarkablepodcast.com/13 days. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Today, let's talk about collaboration. To which most people would say, yay, collaboration is a good thing, isn't it, Kevin? Today, we're going to say, well, yes, and I'll explain more in just a second. Let me introduce you to our guest today. His name is Rob Cross. He's right there. He is the Edward A. Madden Professor of Global Leadership at Babson College. He is a renowned thinker, writer, and speaker whose category-defying ideas have influenced fields as diverse as organizational design, change, collaboration, teams, agility, innovation, and talent optimization. He is the co-founder and research director of the Connected Commons Business Consortium. He has authored 6 Harvard Business Review articles on practical approaches to enhancing collaboration. He's the author of the new book, Beyond Collaboration Overload: How to Work Smarter, Get Ahead, and Restore Our Well-Being, and is the co-author of 5 books, including The Hidden Power of Social Networks. Rob, welcome to the show. Glad that you're here.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I always wish my wife could hear one of those introductions because I tell her I do really important stuff and it gets me nowhere at home. So love hearing the opening there.
It doesn't matter, Rob. I have the same experience. It doesn't matter how smart we are with clients. At home, we're just Kevin and we're just Rob, right? So we have to be very, like if I were to say to my wife, well, I get paid to do coaching, she would say, you can get paid to sleep on the couch. You can sleep on the couch.
Coach somebody else. Yeah,
exactly. I am paying you for coaching. You're my spouse. You're supposed to listen, not coach. Okay. I am glad you're here.
It's a treat.
I said the subtitle, How to Work Smarter, Get Ahead, and Restore Your Well-Being. And I was just on a call with one of my team members, and she said, that sounds pretty good, and that's a tall order. So I suppose we should get to it. But before we get to the book itself, I know lots of people that when they were young, they wanted to be a fireman or a doctor or a lawyer or something. No one probably wanted to be a professor of global leadership when they were like 8. So, tell us just a little bit about the journey that gets you to where you are.
Where I am with these ideas. Yeah, absolutely. So I won't start it at 8 years old. I'll start it at kind of, post MBA work and being in consulting and really enjoying working with organizations, but wanting to get a depth and actually feeling good and I could stand behind some of the advice I was giving, what I was being, situations I was being put into. So pursued the PhD. And as I was coming out of it, it was during the knowledge management craze. This is 23 years ago, and where everybody was trying to design databases and technologies to move ideas around organizations more fluidly. And I had really focused on kind of cognitive aspects of that. If we could design these systems the way other people think, could we move ideas more seamlessly? And, I've started working in a research group at IBM and group of about 40 companies involved in that consortium. And the most amazing thing would happen is I went out and did my reresearch is I'd ask people, well, how did you solve, the biggest client problem you've had, right? Or move a scientific advancement ahead or solve a code issue. And, I'd always hope to hear this is the database, the way we used it. And I never heard that. But I would always hear, well, I reached out to this person or that person and I got expertise or I got a decision approval or I got, other elements of things that helped me solve a problem and move ahead. But it was always through the connections. They may go into the technologies, but it was the connections first. And so that really started, as an idea of saying, well, if we could look at these kind of connections and collaborations that are happening in large groups, it would make visible, a way that work is happening that leaders and everybody really needs to be thinking about. And of course, that took me on a 23-year journey, hundreds of organizations, part of the consortia. And in many ways, seeing the ideas just continue to get more and more important as we move into more and more hyper-connected times. So that's how I got here.
and people are going to see the dot between that and the ideas in this book here in just a minute. But this book, you mentioned that you wanted to do research-based work, and you mentioned you used the word research at least probably 4 or 5 times already. So there's research behind this book, this new book, Beyond Collaboration Overload. So tell us just a little bit. Now, I know as a researcher, it's sort of like your kid. You can tell us a lot, but just tell us a little bit about.
We can go 2 hours, right?
Yeah, we don't have that many minutes. People's exercise routine while they're listening to this podcast is not that long. So, in all seriousness, tell us a little bit about, because it's important, right? Because what you're going to share is based on the research.
Yeah. So it started really, mapping these patterns of connectivity and collaboration. These could be groups of 2,000 up to 80, 90,000 sometimes, where we're looking at who's interacting with whom, what they're getting in those collaborations. So it's a very deep kind of analytical approach of looking at networks, and then not saying that, somebody that knows a lot of people is winning the game, right? That's the knee-jerk reaction in all the books around networks or collaboration, is that more is better. Or find somebody that knows a lot of people and go out and copy what they're doing and claim success. What we focused on was saying, who are the high performers in these groups? They're getting promoted more rapidly, selling more, generating patents more quickly, and then really looking and saying, okay, how are they doing it, right? What are the ways that they're collaborating that we can pick up on analytically and see? And so did that that's well over 15 years of work in kind of mapping these out and teasing that apart. And then over about the past 5 years, the journey switched to say, let's interview these people and really understand kind of pragmatically, what are they doing day in and day out that's enabling them to just kind of scale their accomplishments differently, to live a little bit differently. And so that's been, about almost a little over 800 interviews over the past 5 years I've personally done with men and women, always balanced, and kind of looking at really digging into the practices in different ways.
Perfect. So before I introduced you, I opened with that word collaboration, and I said, it's a good thing. And right. So, and I think you were kind of smiling as I said that. So my question is this: you believe that collaboration is overused and misused. Those might be my words, but I believe that that's what you would say. Why do you say that? I mean, isn't collaboration kind of like motherhood, America, and apple pie?
Apple pie, yeah. It's the knee-jerk reaction that more is always better, right? And I actually think it is critical. And it is, if people have the chance to read the book, you'll get a view of it as being on this infinity loop, that what we see is there are things that people are doing that enable themselves to be about 18 to 24% more efficient than their peers. And they're buying back basically a day a week in their time, and then investing that in a unique way over time that I think matters. But the challenge today is, pre-COVID, people were generally speaking putting about 85% of most of their weeks into time on phone, email, meetings, IM, collaborative activities, one way or the other. That number had grown by about 50% over the past decade. And it has only gone up through COVID, right? 5 to 8 hours.
So let's back up. Because I want you to say that again. Pre-COVID, average person, 85% of their time spent doing what we're going to call in this conversation collaborative activities. And you said meetings, phone calls, emails, conference calls, instant messages.
The collaborative spaces. I mean, most organizations I'm talking to, the leaders are working across up to 9 different platforms to get the work done. And that's become, and rightfully so, it's a product of all these trends we've experienced over the past decade, all the delayerings in organizations, the matrix and sometimes triple dimension matrix designs, the evolution of technologies that are connecting us more instantaneously. And there's undeniably, very positive benefits, right, of those ideas. But there's an unintended consequence that's happening in most of these places of just flat out overwhelming people. And especially as they kind of hit that early and mid-tier leadership level, people are overwhelmed, right? And they need different tools for coping with the demands. And then to also think about, very importantly, that other side of the loop about, if I buy that time back, and this is where I really had to push with the publisher even, is I wanted it to be more than just buying time back. I wanted to say, what do you do with that when you do? right? Because if we just buy it back, people will get faster at doing what they did before. And I really wanted to be able to show, here's, how some of these people are really living differently in there.
And we'll get to that, but I want to make a couple of comments. First of all, we're having this conversation in mid-June of 2021. No one else is going to hear this until at least October. And of course, we don't know when you might personally be listening. But so at this snapshot in mid-June of 2021, I just read this week at economist.com that their research said people are working 30% more hours, 30% more hours. And in one of the many groups that I was working with this week, someone said, I think a bit facetiously, but his point was made, that I'm in 200% more meetings since COVID started. Now, if he was already at 85%, he can't get that. But my point in both of those is to say, it's exactly to your point, where that time is going, what it's going to is collaborative activities. And it's not always getting us better results. We're throwing time at it, but we're not getting more productivity.
Right.
We got a long conversation on that. And that's one of the things I like about the book is because you say, okay, let's fix this. Here's some tactical ways to fix it. We'll get there. And then now what? If you figure out how to fix it, then what do you do with the time that's back? And some people would say, I'd like to get back to 8 or 9 hours, please. That's okay. But that's part of your message as well. And again, we'll get to all that part. Anything else you want to say about sort of during the pandemic or what you see coming out of the pandemic?
I think so. So in going into it, one of the things that has happened that makes that 200% potentially feasible is that the hours have gone to 30-minute meetings, right? And so everybody was trying to jam in more in there, and of course the demands on that are really significant, right? What we don't think about it a lot because we're racing to get through day in and day out. But suddenly you have switching costs that are happening across meetings, right? That just cognitively wear us out a little bit. You have to be more intense in those meetings. You're more focused and more on in those segments. And then you've got more to-dos at the end of the day, right? All those to-dos you're keeping track of as you go through the day on these meetings. Suddenly you've got more of them. And that means more time and more time coordinating with others. And so I think, and we can kind of move on some of the personal tactics in a minute here, but I think organizationally what I'm seeing is that we have gone too far listening to too much advice on, making agile or adaptable organizations and thinking it's just the hierarchy that's causing problems, the decisions up and down. And we've created a lateral collaborative implosion where people don't know, we're not measuring the collaborative footprint of the work and how significant that is. We can track airline receipts down to 2 decimal places, right? But we don't have the ability to see where 85% of this time is going, and that task A, may require a 10%, collaborative task, but task B looks the same, but you're organizing across 2 time zones, 3 people that don't like each other and misaligned incentives. That can be 100 times the task just in the collaborative work that's invisible in most places. And so it's, as you mentioned, going out of the pandemic, I think these ideas that I'm talking about, and part of the reason I put the time, into the book and through the interviews with the COVID, is I think they're only going to get more important. People are going to have to be managing this for themselves more and more. As far as I can tell, there's no chief overload officer.
But that can only happen if the organizations allow that, right? I mean, there's certainly something we can do as individuals, taking our leader hats off. For sure, there are things that we can do to influence it. We're going to talk about some of those things in a second. And I'm a big believer in that. And there's an organizational, or at least a leader component to that as well. I think
there's a huge one right out there. And I look at some of these operating models. The last 200 interviews I did was on chapter 8 and understanding the well-being drivers for people. And the stories I'm hearing, are just unbelievable now about what people are doing to get through the day. And we don't see it. The amazing thing to me is these would be 200 super successful people, on all walks of life in great organizations.
Looks like they're doing great. Everything's under control. They look, and they're like a duck.
Right. And that's exactly what would happen. I'd be in these interviews, and the first 15 minutes, people are joking and laughing. And then by the time I get down to 45 or 60 minutes, because they're pretty intense discussions, they're barely getting by. Many, many, many people. And it really is, a product of these operating models that are trying to squeeze, more and more out of people. And so that at some point, it is hitting a natural, endpoint right now in many ways.
Rob, I haven't read every page, but I've read more than enough to know that people ought to read every page of the book, Beyond Collaboration Overload by Rob Cross. But Rob, I think to me, here's the big idea. No one has any question about overload, but they're not necessarily connecting the overload to all of what you're calling the collaborative activities. But when you go back and listen to what Rob said, meetings, calls, collaborative spaces, technology tools for communication, emails, instant messages, all of that, turning on your webcam, all of that stuff is all about collaboration. It's not about doing work on our own. Right. And so I think that hooking that together is such an important part of this. So if I want to be more effective, if I want to work smarter, get ahead, and restore my well-being, the big promise in your subtitle, what are some of the strategies that I can do?
So let me start on one side, because I think it's really important. If I come back and say, here's what happy people do, and I mean that tongue in cheek, but we've measured for well over 15 years now in all these assessments, not just were they performing well, but are they scoring higher on measures of career satisfaction, resilience, thriving. So the idea is I'm looking for what creates sustainable performance in people today. And if I just start off saying, here's what the happy people do, the first reaction is I don't have time, right, from everybody, because they're overwhelmed. And so to me, the first step is to really take seriously this notion that we can take actions that enable us to get what my data shows about 18 to 24% time back, right? For the typical kind of, first level manager leader. I don't really focus as much on the senior executives, because quite honestly, when they have snuck through, they're in a different place. It's really the mid and the initial tier of leader that is getting hammered today. But without going into a ton of detail, you'll see in the book is that it's about first how people put structure in their work. So the more efficient collaborators, they're more likely to strategically calendar Friday night or Sunday night, 1 week and 3 week time horizons with a broader set of priorities, not just reacting to things coming at them, but being proactive in putting in things that they care about in their work and pulling to a North Star. They're more likely to manage to a rhythm of work that matters for them. So I would, as I went through these interviews, I talked to some people and they would say, well, the first thing I do is email, right? And get that out of the way. And then I go on to my day. And the next person would look at me and say, are you crazy? Why would I start with email? And I start with the creative stuff, and I block email in 30-minute intervals. I communicate it to my team, and people work around me, right? And I'm actually much more likely to get to that creative rather than email begetting email.
Okay, let's just stop right there. Because that one thing right there, everybody who's watching or listening, that right there is worth the whole call. I have had that conversation with hundreds of leaders and folks. And here's my point about that. Like, if you block your email times and you said it, everybody else knows you're more effective, you're more productive, 100%. Guess what? So is everybody else.
Right.
This isn't really selfish.
Right.
It may feel selfish to you right now based on how you're doing it now, but at the end of the day, as a leader of a team and someone who largely does this, and a lot of the other things that you talk about in the book, maybe that's why I like the book, Rob. But the reality is that as you get more productive as a leader, you're helping the team get more productive as well. Automatically. I'll let you go on. I think it's not to mention that.
Exactly it. I mean, people, there are tactical things that these people are doing. So, for example, it's not so much email that kills us. It's the culture of use that we allow to persist around the spheres we can control, right? And so just sitting with the team and establishing some norms around, okay, for example, we may have to do email at 10 o'clock at night because that's when the children are in bed. That's our space to do it. But you don't send it then, right? You send it on a delay in the morning, and just simple agreements on that, the length of these things, whatever, has a big impact. And people will come back and say, well, I can't control all email, right? It's the client that's going to get to me or whatever. But you can oftentimes control 60% of it, right? And if you really focus on these items, the smaller items, in terms of how you're putting structure in or the tactical ways you're managing collaboration, you get a lot back in the small things. The other big thing I'll mention is that surprised me in this. I came into the overload game convinced that the enemy was out there. It was time zones, emails, nasty bosses, demanding clients. And I came out the other end really aware that we all also have these triggers that lead us to jump in when we shouldn't, and so for some, it's a desire to help. For others, it's a desire for status. For some, it's a desire for accomplishment. For some, it's fear. For some, it's fear of missing out. And that those tend to be about 50% of the problem, right? They don't manifest immediately, but but it's huge.
And I'm just going to add micromanagement to that list, by the way. But that's a perfect list, right? Fear of missing out, not wanting to help.
Right.
All of that list is exactly right. And
they're all great things.
Afflicted by some of them, right?
The funny thing is they're all great, right? I mean, the servant-based mindset to leadership, who would argue with that? But if you do it in a certain way and you become the path of least resistance, and that's not ever scalable, right? At some point, it's going to, wear you down. And so it's really a matter of, being aware of. In that moment, I describe it to people as everybody's had the experience of being asked to do something, and they know with every fiber of their being they shouldn't do it, right? Yet in that next second, we come up with the 53 reasons why we have to go do this thing and justify it and get in. It's that trigger that you're looking for. And you may not see the overload for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 12, but it starts oftentimes a lot more with our own action.
The dominoes are falling. I have to tell everybody about this book. We are talking with Rob Cross about his new book, Beyond Collaboration Overload. And I will tell you that if you pick this book up and you start reading the first chapter, while it's fictionalized, it feels like you're reading a novel. Like if I dare you to read the first 3 pages and not finish the first chapter. And it won't feel like you're reading a business book yet. I mean, it's business connected, but it feels like a story. Unfortunately, it's true.
Right.
Although the names have been dragnet changed to protect the innocent.
Exactly. Everything is disguised in it.
So no worries about that. I'm not going to be interviewed by Rob because I'm going to make his next book. That's not the point. Okay. So how do we know if we're in overload? I mean, maybe that's a silly question because probably everyone who's listening say like, Rob, I'm right with you. But
most people would.
What's the way? Because some people, hey, I'm busy. Hey, I'm doing a lot of stuff. I am trying to helping lots of people. Yeah, I got a lot to do, but I got an important job. Like, how do we make sure that we say, hey, yes, I'm in overload, collaboration overload?
Right. I think the really seductive problem with collaborative overload in all my experience in this and people's stories behind it is it feels good right up until it doesn't. Right. It feels like you're in the thick of things. People are responding on you. You're high energy. Things are happening. And it's great right up until that last piece of work hits or your significant other says no more or, any number of things kind of start things, negatively spiraling. And the interesting thing with the more senior leaders is what we see around them is they're also not aware of what's not getting to them. Right. And they can't see the disengagement they're driving, because those people 2 layers out can't get access to them that we can pick up in the networks. We can start to see that. And, some of the studies we did showed that the leaders that allowed themselves to get overwhelmed, the attrition rates around them were as much as 200% greater, right? And so what happens then is, you let yourself fall into that position. You haven't built the relationships the way you should. In a couple of different capacities. And when you start to falter, it can happen really fast, because you don't have people around you, they're leaving, other things like that. So I think for me, it's part and part a personal question, right? And yes. The very first priority I have in the imposed structure chapter is, do you have really great clarity on the capabilities you want to be utilizing in the next 5 years, and great clarity on the values you want to be experiencing in your work? And I don't mean anything vague. I mean, do you like innovating, helping others, mentoring? And are those things a part of the fabric of what you're doing? Right. I think that would be the first really big question, because we can all be busy, but the question is, are you busy in a way that is pulling you to kind of who you want to be and situating what you're contributing in a way that has the biggest impact?
Rob, you used my least favorite 4-letter word. I tell people that busy is the most dangerous 4-letter word in America, much to the, I'm sure, chagrin of my dearly departed grandmother, who would probably pick a different 4-letter word. But it is a dangerous word. And I love your point about it's seductive, because I think it's true. I think it's true. We are drawn to it for lots of reasons, and yet we curse it as it's happening and the outcomes of it. You said from the start 2 things here, like how do we extricate ourselves from the collaborative overload? And then if we're successful doing that, 18 to 24% of our time, how should we spend the time we get back?
Right, right. So for me, the second part of the book, it's really focused on kind of chapter 6. You see me going through this in my head, is really 6 and 7 are around the biggest performance drivers, the things that we can see from a network standpoint that most get and keep people in the upwardly mobile category across hundreds of organizations now. And the first idea is it's a broad network, early stage problem solving. And so the best, quick way I can describe this is, you have 8 things going on. The 9th lands. There's a category of person that takes that 9th and just hunkers down to get it done and reaches to the same people they've been relying on, for the past 8 things. And there's another category that's bought back just enough time that they're a little bit more expansive in the network. They're kind of reaching to adjacent areas and saying, gosh, could we do this together? Could we produce a better client impact? Could we do something more significant? And it's that second category that wins, right? And it makes sense intuitively. They're not doing political things as much. That's a piece of it to some degree, but it's more about they're accomplishing bigger things and they're building reputational capital. Things start flowing to them as they do that over time. So that would be the one idea, like is in that micro moment where you feel like you can't look at this or can't take the time to explore this option. Everybody's in the 200 interviews I did around career defining successes, I would say 98% of them started in that small moment where people paused and kind of reached out in different ways. And we forget that, as we kind of go through a 2 or 3 year battle, but that would be the first thing. The second thing is, it has really surprised me in the work. I didn't expect to see this, but what we've seen is that the biggest predictor of a high performer, it's not reaching and getting stuff from the network. It's actually being somebody that creates energy or enthusiasm. And so we find that these people are much more likely, 4 times as likely to be and stay high performers. And they're not just cheerleaders, right? There's a lot of different things they're doing that kind of create that engagement. But they win over time because they get better ideas flowing their way, better talent, wants to stay with them. Client wants to buy more. I mean, you name it. Mm-hmm. The trick and the reason that I put this on this infinity loop in all this game is the very first thing you stop doing when you are collaboratively overwhelmed is you stop reaching broadly early stage problem solving, right? You start hunkering down and just getting work done. And then you stop coming into interactions in ways that energize others, right? You come in focusing on your stuff, what you need to get done. And so it starts to take away how those people are getting scale, right? In ways that they're collaborating.
You either focus on your stuff or you at least focus on just the work and no longer anything, right? It just like, yeah, I think that the 2 ideas that you just shared are so important because I can't imagine someone who's watching or listening to this that hasn't experienced that. And to use those as markers and to use those as predictors, I think is extremely valuable. And I really appreciate you sharing that. Rob, before we sort of move into the last portion of our conversation, is there anything else that I should have asked or you wish that I asked, or is there another point that you think would be valuable for us to talk about?
Yeah, I'll share one idea that again kind of came at me as an unintended consequence, I guess, of doing this work. But chapter 8 to me is very heavily around well-being and really looking at kind of how are people interacting today in ways that just make them happier. And I mean that, a bunch of different ways we've looked at it. What got me intrigued by that is almost every single model out there of what creates a happy person has relationships in it, or the Harvard longevity studies. Turns out authentic connections are more important than cholesterol levels or things like that. It shows up over and over and over again. Yet there had never been much emphasis around, outside of just acknowledging that, much emphasis around, well, what are we getting from these connections? How do we form them, maintain them? What if we get busy mid-career, we fall out of groups that were important? How do we get back in? All these things that really matter in terms of the tactics of how you have these connections. Because otherwise it just becomes, we'll be social, right? We'll go to virtual cocktail hours or we'll do other things like that without understanding the granularity. So that part of the book is really focused very specifically on what we've learned about more physically healthy people, what they're doing in the role of interactions, how people get a sense of purpose, not as a product of the work, but the way they're connecting with others. But I'll tell you the thing that surprised me and has become another really big effort for me is all these interviews, I'd be asking people, tell me about a time you were becoming more physically healthy, right, in your life. And not what you were doing, but what was the role of the connections around you. They're wonderful stories, of people and how they just salvaged their life and their health and the ways that relationships very systematically played a role and what that meant. And then on a whim, the very first interview, I said, well, what got you in trouble to begin with? And kind of how did you get to that point that the doctor was telling you better do something? And there was this pause, and the person, very senior life science executive in London, and she said, just life, right? And it wasn't like a major setback, or a major health problem or something like that. And so we spent
ongoing collaboration overload, if you will.
Right. And it just, I've come to call these micro-stresses, but what we see is that, we progress at certain points in our lives, and we get through relationships, through connections that are coming at us, these small touch points constantly through a day where we're sensing misalignment with a colleague. We see a team member that needs to be coached. We see an ambiguous touch from our child that we can't figure out. Is there something wrong? Are they done with it in 5 minutes? And we're stewing for 3 hours worried. And, because of how interconnected we are, these things are coming at us at a pace, volume, and velocity we've never seen. And we go home exhausted, but we can't quite put our finger on what happened. Cognitively, we're not good at that. We don't see the small. We think about the one or two big things. And what we're finding is there's real magic in understanding the small, whether it's how to reclaim time in collaborative overload, or in really thinking about where are these micro stresses coming from and how do I be proactive against them. And I think it's a big deal, because most of the mindfulness and other work that's going on today is people are worried about stress and burnout. This is great stuff. I mean, fundamentally, great and valid things, but at their heart, they're teaching people to persist in the system they've created. Right, better, right, more healthy, and I think
as opposed to
adapting, right,
which is, I think, the big idea of this book. Yeah. Hey, what we got ain't working. We need that. How about that? There's my new version of the.
I like it. I should have titled it that way. I wish. That's so much better. What we got.
No, I don't know. I love the title. I mean, I like that title. What did I say? I should write that down and write that book. But right. But I love your title, So now I'm going to shift gears, and we're talking about well-being. We've talked about healthiness, and happiness. I want to know what you do for fun, Roger.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, well, I practice a lot of the ideas in the book itself. So when I mentioned about people that become physically healthy, I hit my own point, and I decided to get into a biking group. So I bike about 150 miles a week, and become an avid tennis player and do other things. But quite frankly, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in the book, it happened to me with the success of the consortium and everything else. I was working to a point that I needed to get these anchors out and kind of help recreate some traction in my life in different ways. And again, if I had another thought that I would leave for people to really hold on to, is that you don't want to get unidimensional in work. You want to always have at least 2 or 3 groups you're a part of outside of work. And those can be, for me, it happens to be biking and a couple of other things. But that's what is enabling people to keep perspective today. And one of the reasons COVID's so hard, right, is part of it is we're working harder. We talked about that. What we miss a lot of times is we've been pulled out of those groups that kept us sane to begin with. The book clubs, the church, the running groups, whatever. And it's again going to be more important than ever that people manage that on their own as we move into this, remote hybrid context, and think about it.
I agree 100%. So the only question you knew I was going to ask you is this one these days. Tell us something you're reading or have read that you might recommend that people other than Beyond Collaboration Overload.
Right. We won't take that one. So I did get forewarning, and I grabbed the book that's currently on the side of my desk, and it's Vivek Murthy's Together. Right, and it's one of a fantastic kind of focus around the problems with isolation, even in our hyper-connected world. And I had the chance to speak with him as he was writing the book and kind of talk about some of the ideas. And it was a stimulus for me in this well-being work. What's great about the book is it really talks about the effects of this and what's happening. And it really kind of spurred me to be thinking about how do we, really help people get traction on what they need to go do, right? And try to kind of push that down in different layers. So that's the one right now for me.
That's a phenomenal book. We'll have the link to that If you missed it, you're not taking notes while you're listening to this podcast, we'll have that as we always do in the show notes, as well as a link to how you can get a copy of Beyond Collaboration Overload. But beyond that, Rob, what else do you want to know? What do you want people to know about how they can connect with you? Where can they learn more about your work, get the book, etc.?
Oh, great. Yeah.
Chance.
So, I mean, certainly, look, the consortium I run, the Connected Commons, we make a tremendous amount of resources available to everybody in terms of white papers, different tools we're building, other things like that. And then my website, robcross.org, we're consistently working with the consortium today in ways that we're taking softwares and tools that we're building, making them accessible to everybody. So there is a collaborative overload diagnostic that was in the first Harvard Business Review piece on this, and other tools that people can come out and use. So I definitely urge looking at those as resources to kind of supplement ideas in the book as well.
Perfect. Well, before we go, everybody, I have the question I ask you all every week. It's always the same question. It's always relevant. Rob's going to like it. The question is, now what? What are you going to do with this? And I'm not talking about buying a book, although you should definitely do that. I'm talking about what action are you going to take? What relationship or group are you going to rekindle? What trigger did you hear Rob talk about that you need to pay more attention to? What structure are you going to put around your calendar or your email or your expectations or your meetings? What are you going to take from this and take action on? Because unless you do that, we were mildly entertaining, Rob, but the real value is if people take action. And I know that you hope that as well.
Could not agree more. Absolutely.
As well. Rob, thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a treat
to have you. Our episode today was brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Each month we release a new skill in an advanced form of masterclass format designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or get discounts each month can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And with that, it's another episode in the books, and we'll be back next week, as we always are, with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.